Bonjour, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Catherine Marshall, speaking from Washington, D.C., from the Berkeley Center, which is one of a group of organizations, parts of Georgetown University and beyond, that are sponsoring what I think will be a fascinating event today, focused on the story of the partnership that has essentially eliminated onchocerciasis or river blindness in Africa and in other parts of the world. Some housekeeping details. First, the meeting is being recorded, and anyone who registered will receive an email with the recording. Um, Secondly, we have a very tight program because it's a complex story that we wanted to tell as much as we could. But please do put questions in the Q&A. We'll get to some of them, but probably not too many. And we'll be coming back to you on those. The program today, as I said, is about a remarkable partnership. And partnership is something we all yearn for and strive to develop across the development field, public health, and others. This one really stands out among all of them. And Bruce Benton, my colleague and friend, has written a remarkable book on river blindness in Africa, which he will be presenting to you. But so you have an idea of the run of show today, we will be moving through very rapidly 3 panels that focus on 3 elements that we see as critical to the partnership, which are compassion, commitment, and innovation. And we'll have a very brief moment at the end for a conclusion. So with that, I will pass it on to the book's author, Bruce Benton, who just to give a little background, have worked on this issue and topic for many years. Bruce, I think, has far deeper and longer commitment, personal commitment, and the success of the partnership owes in no small way to his personal involvement, grit, determination, patience, and creativity. So with that, let me turn it over to Bruce. And what we will do after that is each speaker or chair of a panel will be passing it to the next one. So if you remember, it's compassion, commitment, and innovation. Over to you, Bruce.
Thank you, Catherine. And welcome to all of you participating in this symposium on compassion, commitment, and innovation. These topics are key in global health, and each has been instrumental to the onco success in Africa, as outlined in the book. When undertaking research for the book, compassion was not on my radar, but it showed up frequently in interviews. It became clear it was fundamental to establishing both onco programs, OCP and APOC. The impetus to alleviate suffering drove key decisions around launching them. When pressing forward with the West African OCP, World Bank President Robert McNamara spoke of, quote, millions experiencing a fate worse than death, blind in their prime and unable to contribute to society, unquote. He was deeply affected by the onco victims he encountered along the Black Volta River in 1972. Development was important, but humanitarian considerations prevailed in launching this first ever World Bank intervention in health. A decisive ingredient for successful control has been Merck's donation of ivermectin. Compassion underlay that bold decision by CEO Roy Vagelos. In interviews for the book, he remarked, quote, when I knew we had a drug that could affect millions of lives, I was going to push it through. I did not care if Merck's business people had reservations, it was the right thing to do, unquote. Vagelos characterized himself as basically a doctor with compassion for the patient, who happened to be leading Merck. Immediately following the regulatory approval of ivermectin, Vagelos took that game-changing decision and bypassed Merck's board to avoid delay. The donation proved to be instrumental in successfully concluding OCP, launching APOC, and eventually treating 100+ million Africans annually. Compassion enhanced donor and NGO support and drove the impressive dedication of the African program directors. The book recounts how Kuwait joined the effort and became one of its most steadfast donors. The Kuwait Fund Director General, who brought Kuwait in, cited as key considerations compassion for fellow developing countries suffering from the disease, and the obligation under Islam to protect the poor, to help the poor, Religious sourced compassion also motivated active faith-based NGOs such as the Interchurch Medical Assistance and Christoffel Blinden Mission. Several features of onchocerciasis strongly elicit compassion, notably high infection levels, devastating the poorest of the poor in remote rural areas, blindness depriving victims in their prime of the ability to eke out a subsistence living, and the anguish of never-ending excruciating itching. Compassion explains the appeal of the larger-than-life-size sculpture of a child leading a blind adult, prominently displayed at Merck, World Bank, WHO, and other partner headquarters. It's an 8-foot-high version of the statue behind me here, which from the same artist, R.T. Wallen, and which, by the way, is a gift from President Carter, who himself has been driven by compassion for those suffering from parasitic diseases. Two compassion-related questions are important. How to harness compassion programmatically to alleviate suffering from NTDs impacting 1 billion Africans, and how to sustain international commitment to eliminate onchocerciasis given the dramatic declines already achieved in its major manifestations, blindness and skin disease. Second topic, commitment, instilled by compassion, has been a hallmark of onchocontrol in Africa. It was expected in 1974 that full control in West Africa would take 2 decades. Hence the partnership launched by the World Bank, consisting of African governments, donors, and 4 sponsoring agencies, committed to a 20-year effort protecting a region twice the size of France. The duration was unprecedented. Remarkably, the partnership extended that commitment for 40+ years and tripled the size of the effort to cover all 31 endemic countries on the continent. The 9 original donors backed the programs for an historic 35 years, and all 27 donors contributed more than $1 billion to finance them. Joint WHO World Bank program co-sponsorship persisted for more than 4 decades. Merck's Mectizan donation program is now in its 34th year, and current CEO Ken Frazier has committed to extending it until elimination of the disease everywhere. What explains this dedicated commitment? I attribute it to the fulfillment derived from alleviating suffering from the highly vulnerable rural poor and remarkable results on the ground. Within the first decade, the parasite reservoir was disappearing in the population. Shortly after, blindness and skin disease declined rapidly. The control strategies were working and achieving the program's goals of eliminating onco as a public health problem. On topic 3, innovation. The onco programs adapted continuously through a sustained commitment to operational research. Innovations were numerous and groundbreaking. 4 stand out. 1, establishing a regional program to control, which became the largest intercountry health program in the world by the mid-1980s. Going regional solidified the cross-country collaboration necessary for comprehensive control. 2, undertaking a massive high-tech vector control operation treating 50,000 kilometers of rivers a week with environmentally safe insecticides to protect 35 million West Africans from transmission. 3, the discovery, donation, and delivery of ivermectin under a novel public-private partnership. And 4, the discovery and implementation of Africa-wide of an ingenious community-directed method of delivering the drug to reach a sufficiently high percentage of the population to eliminate the disease over time. A final thought. The control effort has eliminated onchocerciasis as a public health problem throughout the continent, with the exception of a subregion in Central Africa. Prevalence is approaching 1% or less everywhere in Africa, except for a 6-country contiguous area, including the 2 Congos, Central African Republic, South Sudan, Cameroon, and Angola. Populations there are co-endemic with onco and Loa Loa, posing the risk of Loa-induced encephalopathy following ivermectin treatment. The most important next step going forward is to develop a safe and effective strategy to achieve comprehensive control in this subregion. This is imperative if onchocerciasis is to be eliminated continent-wide. Thank you. And to continue, I'd like to introduce David Addis, who is the director of the focal area for compassion and ethics at the Task Force for Global Health. David will chair the panel on compassion. Thank you again for listening.
Thank you very much, Bruce. I'm really pleased to chair this next panel. As Bruce noted, compassion, or the desire to alleviate suffering, drove key decisions in onchocerciasis control, and it remains a very strong motivation for many people who are engaged in global health. In this first panel, we'll be exploring how and where compassion was revealed or where it was active in onchocerciasis control from the perspectives of 4 key sectors or partners: the World Bank, non-governmental organizations, Merck and Company, and the APOC program itself. First, I'd like to say a few words about compassion, which has been the subject of intensive study by neuroscience and psychology in recent years. And these fields teach us that there's 3 fundamental components that are required for compassionate response to suffering. First is cognitive. We have to be aware of suffering. We have to recognize suffering as suffering. Second, this cognitive awareness can lead to an emotional resonance or empathy where we feel the pain of the other person. And third, compassion requires action, or at the very least, the desire to alleviate suffering. So in a sense, compassion is empathy plus action. A second comment is that neuroscience teaches us that compassion activates the neural circuits of the brain that are associated with pleasure. So in a sense, it's no surprise that compassion motivated key decisions in onchocerciasis control. And third, mature compassion is rooted in solidarity and respect and a deep sense of interconnectedness. Compassion is not pity, which can be condescending and disempowering. True compassion, which is informed by wisdom, as well as the skillful means to alleviate and prevent suffering, leads to social justice. Without further delay, I'd like to ask our panelists to speak each for 5 minutes or less, leaving a few minutes for questions if we have the time. And I've asked them to reflect on in what ways and to what extent was compassion a motivating or a sustaining force in onchocerciasis control efforts in Africa. Our first speaker is Dr. Catherine Marshall, who you've already met as the chair of our event today. She's a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University, and she was formerly World Bank Director for the Sahel countries. Over to you, Dr. Marshall.
I'm speaking here largely in my historic role as working in the World Bank, with contacts over many years in different roles with the onchocerciasis program. And in these very few minutes, I want to make 4 points. The first one is that the decision by Robert McNamara, Roger Chaufournier, and others to support the onchocerciasis control program was really a turning point in approaches to health. Because earlier in its early decades, the World Bank essentially viewed health and education and nutrition and other topics like that as not really part of the World Bank's mission. But it was compassion, but also the link between onchocerciasis and agricultural productivity and welfare of the population that helped to turn so that health now is one of the major focal areas of international development, with a rich appreciation of its links to other elements, which brings me to the second point. On the World Bank's entrance in marble, you have "Our dream is a world free of poverty," which you could, I think, easily say is ethical, but also very much linked to a compassionate drive to eliminate poverty. Another phrase is "fighting poverty with passion and professionalism," passion and professionalism. And I think that that highlights a continuing link between what was clear in the ONCO program, which was that eliminating this terrible disease was something that unleashed productivity and improved welfare on a continuing basis. So I think you still have this, in a sense, tension between the ethical, the compassionate, and the desire, which comes under the guise of professionalism, to demonstrate what it does. I think that the ONCO program and its long history highlights the complex boundaries between charity and humanitarian efforts and what we call development, though that is a term that in many ways is going out of style. But you have within the global governance system institutions that focus on humanitarian relief, which is very much about human suffering after an earthquake or a war or a famine, whereas development is designed to bring lasting change, which we now call sustainable. But what this has brought out is the links, the complex links between the health, the suffering, the welfare of the population, and the development objectives. And Bruce's book is a very complex story of that. And the final point that I would make is that charity and compassion and human rights are linked in complex ways, but they're also different. And the boundaries between them are fuzzy. As we focus on the right to development, people's rights to food, rights to water, rights to health, that is a human right which is intrinsic in the human condition. But as we look at that, at the human rights dimension, we don't want to lose track of the human dimension, the caring and the compassion. We know the flaws of charity, which can be more for the giver than for the receiver, which have possibilities of all kinds of undermining qualities. But there is so much good in charity and caring that we need, as we look forward, to find ways to link this understanding of intrinsic rights, solidarity, the equality of all human beings, their religious, but also their sheer humanity, along with the desire to help and to care about others. So I'll turn it over back to you, David.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Those were really both provocative and very thoughtful comments, and I hope they frame some of our discussion. Appreciate your raising some of these other issues. It's not just compassion. Compassion exists in this ecosystem of human rights and other considerations. I'd like now to introduce Dr. Adrienne Hopkins to speak next from the perspective of non-governmental organizations in the Onchocerciasis Control Initiative. Dr. Hopkins was former medical director of Christoffel Blinden Mission based in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Central African Republic. And he's also been director of the Mectizan Donation Program, excuse me. Adrienne, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, David. When we look at religious or humanitarian organizations, we can see they've often been at the forefront of social change, and that includes also in health. I think when you look at many hospitals, they have religious foundations, or they're based on philanthropy from specific individuals. In the medical field, care from non-governmental organizations has often been a little bit more holistic. It's not just care, curative care, but it's looking at other issues related to health, such as the foundation of hospices for their end-of-life care, care of the old when families can no longer cope. When you look at low-income countries, this holistic approach has really led NGOs to be looking to care for patients, both in terms of curative care, but also looking at those who are suffering from disability. Often these organizations were non-governmental, particularly in Africa, because in the 19th, early 20th century, governments were colonial governments, and often the emphasis was more on keeping control and sometimes exploitation rather than the long-term welfare of the population. Although, to be fair, many colonial health and even military health services were very concerned for the medical care of the population, and they were also involved in research. Long-term care of patients with leprosy was probably one of the first major interventions that NGOs were involved in some low-income countries. But when it came to river blindness in Africa, many NGOs were first involved because of the rehabilitation of the blind in areas where there was a lot of onchocerciasis. They were teaching skills, revenue generation, to give those who had lost their sight some sort of standing within their communities. In fact, when I first began my work in the northwest of CAR in a place called Bosangwa with the Ministry of Health, but sponsored by CBM, Christoffel Blinden Mission, there was already a very active CBM program for rehabilitation of the blind. And it was in the Central African Republic that actually, I would say I had a defining moment in terms of onchocerciasis. I'm just going to share a picture with you. When I first went to the Central African Republic, I did a trip into the village around Bosangwa, unannounced. I stopped in villages, and that afternoon I actually saw 32 blind people. They were just sitting around in the villages that I went to see. When I examined them, I was looking for patients for my cataract surgery. Of those 32 patients, I could do nothing for any of them. They were all onco-blind. And for me, that was a defining moment because we could not do anything medically, ophthalmologically for these patients, but we could do something to prevent the rest of the children following on from the same fate as their parents or grandparents. And this is what motivates, this compassion motivates you. When you see people who suffer, and we've just had some allusion to that from David, when you see suffering, you feel some empathy for these populations, you really feel you have to do something about it. But compassion isn't just charity, it's not just feeling, it's some action. And even NGOs have been involved. For example, Sightsavers were very involved in some of the early research that went on in West Africa. A OCP was very much tied to West Africa, but there was a lot of blinding onchocerciasis in other African countries. Major foci in Nigeria, for example, all the way through to East Africa as far as Tanzania. And as Mectizan or ivermectin became available, NGOs realized that there was a tool available to prevent the blindness amongst the populations. And this compassion led to the creation of community Mectizan distribution in these badly affected areas. As programs developed, it became clear that what was needed was also some coordination, some consistency, some good practice. And the NGOs got together under the leadership of Bjorn Tillefors at WHO and developed a coordination organization. This built up, in fact, to around a 5 million a year investment every year from the NGOs in these areas that were outside of OCP. But with the ongoing research into onchocerciasis, it also became pretty clear that the problem was much bigger. So with endemic countries, with the World Bank, with WHO and the NGOs, all these different partners, stakeholders got together, and basically there was the creation of APOC as a result. Others will describe that, so I won't go into that. But just one little episode. I remember when we had one very heated discussion amongst the NGO coordination group about how we should be doing some of the Mectizan distribution. And it got very divisive, in fact. But Dr. Mike Heisler, who was then the director of the Mectizan donation program, he brought us back to our fundamentals. What are we actually trying to achieve with this distribution of Mectizan? What are we in business for? And when we all said, well, we want to get as much Mectizan out to as many people who need it as quickly as possible. And we came back to that starting point, and that we may not have expressed it as compassion, but that passion for helping people who needed the Mectizan created a new start and a new way forward. And that united us in compassion. And just to conclude, nearly all of the NGOs who were in the onco business in the 1990s are still active today, a sign of their compassion and ongoing commitment. Now, of course, with new objectives of elimination of transmission, we want to eliminate that risk of recurrence. But the NGOs are still there, and they're still promising to be there until the job is finished. So thank you very much. Back to you, David.
Thank you very much, Adrian. And if you can unshare your screen, we'll return. Thank you for those comments. And I really appreciate the way you showed how compassion leads to commitment. It's required actually for that action. And then innovation arises from that. And then at times we need to circle back to the original source of their motivation, which is compassion. So thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Brenda Colatrella, who is Associate Vice President of Corporate Responsibility at Merck & Company. Brenda has played a key role, an essential role in making Mectizan available for onchocerciasis control and elimination in her position at Merck, and she's been an absolutely very strong advocate for the program. Brenda, it's a delight to have you here with us. In our earlier conversations, I've been aware that particularly in scientific circles and sometimes in corporate circles, we're hesitant to claim the word compassion for ourselves. And so we might use words such as doing the right thing, as you heard earlier from Roy Vagelos. And so we don't need to focus only on the word compassion, but its affiliates and other related emotions that, broadly speaking, fall into this desire to alleviate suffering. So Brenda, thanks so much for being with us. We look forward to your perspective from Merck.
Thank you, David. So it's always a pleasure for me to talk about Merck and the Mectizan donation program, and particularly the factors that have been essential to its success. In fact, at a recent event held by the Task Force for Global Health, I had an opportunity to talk about the secret sauce for success. At that time, I mentioned several key ingredients that were particularly meaningful from my perspective, including just very briefly, the unprecedented open-ended commitment by our CEO at the time, Dr. Roy Vagelos, to make Mectizan available to all who needed it for as long as needed. We had a medicine that lent itself to mass or community-directed distribution, critical funding to finance the operations of the effort, strong proactive support from key international and multilateral agencies, a resilient and committed group of NGOs, enthusiastic Ministry of Health and country-level commitment, and perhaps most important, a really impressive level of trust and collaboration among partners. However, the one factor I touched on only very lightly during that summit and only in my closing comments, and which is a central feature of today's conversation, is the role that compassion played in both the initiation of this program as well as its progress to date. And I do agree that it has been a critical element, but David, as you pointed out, I don't know that at Merck we've always characterized or thought about it as compassion per se, but more about doing what is right and, if you will, a compulsion for meeting unmet medical needs. So, this sense of compassion and commitment were certainly influential right from the start. Perhaps first and foremost were the interest by Dr. Bill Campbell and the decision by Dr. Vagelos to pursue further research on a compound for a disease where it was really clear at the start that there would be no commercial market. That decision was a direct result of the overriding mission of Merck to improve the health and well-being of people through our innovations. And then, of course, there's the ultimate decision by Dr. Vagelos to donate the medicine once it was clear that there was no one or no entity in a position to or willing to fund the procurement of Mectizan, even at a very low price. The alternative, which was to let Mectizan sit on a shelf, was just not a viable option because of these strongly held values. Compassion has also been an underlying influence throughout the program's implementation and operations, as well as in Merck's overall approach to addressing global health issues. At each turn, taking into consideration the right thing to do for the patient or population. Bruce mentioned in his opening remarks today that Dr. Vagelos' decision to donate Mectizan was grounded in what he thought was right at the time. He didn't go to the Merck board in advance for approval. He was not overly concerned about the business aspects. Given the magnitude of what Mectizan could achieve in terms of improving lives of those affected, and because of the people managing and governing the company, Dr. Vagelos knew he would have the support he needed, and he was right. I suspect, however, that since Merck was also in a strong financial position at that time, making that significant commitment was likely a little bit more palatable for those that were more business focused. So fast forward to present day, more than 30 years after that decision, our current CEO, Ken Frazier, when asked to reflect on the thinking behind Merck's decision, said, "The Mectizan donation program is a manifestation of the core values that Merck people subscribe to." So 30 years later, this idea of operating with compassion and purpose prevails. And there are just two related points I want to make. So I think it's important to remember that institutions are made up of people, and it's the people within those walls that make the decisions. Those people often speak and act based on their inherent beliefs and core values, regardless of if they work in the public or the private sector. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to make presentations to MPH students where their gut reaction was to consider a career in the private sector as having gone over to the dark side. I think that's a bit of a short-sighted and perhaps uninformed viewpoint. So I would just encourage those looking at career paths to at least be open to the idea of bringing their talents to private sector companies that share their values. Secondly, there are ancillary benefits for a company that acts with integrity, trust, and compassion. Such an approach helps to retain and attract the best and the brightest. People choose to work in companies, and especially this new generation of workers, they choose to work in companies that are viewed as compassionate and caring. And as Ken Frazier has pointed out, employees who work for companies that act in good faith become imbued with a sense of purpose. So yes, the themes of today's event, compassion, commitment, and innovation, are central in global health. I think there's no denying that. And for the record, though, I would just add one more to that list, and that would be collaboration. So looking into the future, there's much that's been achieved since the early days of the control program. The partnership has evolved, And now the focus has shifted to elimination of river blindness globally. Innovation, commitment, collaboration, trust, and certainly compassion will certainly be essential to what's needed to complete the job of elimination. And I'll just end by saying that I know all Merck employees are very proud to be part of a company that demonstrated such bold leadership and compassion back in 1987 when the donation decision was made. It's a decision that is now leading to the elimination of a devastating disease, and that catalyzed a program that can and does serve as a useful model for other global health challenges. So with that, I thank you for being part of the panel, and it's just really nice to see everyone again.
Thank you so much, Brenda. Thanks for reminding us about these core values and the importance of trust and collaboration that really grows out of that shared commitment for compassionate action and alleviating suffering. Our fourth panelist, hopefully she's joined us now, is Dr. Uche Amazigo, who directed the African Program for Onchocerciasis Control for many years and has a strong reputation for both human rights and compassion. And Uche, would like to invite you to speak to compassion as it emerged in the day-to-day work of APOC. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Davis, for inviting me. This is, I think, a very strong and very special topic, compassion. I'm not sure I'm the right person to speak for APOC management, but I will try because it's been a while. I agree with the colleagues about the meaning of compassion and the link between compassion and that compassion is different from charity. Compassion really for the management of APOC, I would say it was linked to a strong motivation, a strong desire to alleviate human suffering. That's for me, overall, that was what united us at APOC. That was what drove and provided us the energy to do certain things and to work for long hours. And that was also, that compassion was the thread, one would say, that linked the APOC management, the non-governmental development organizations, the committee of sponsoring agencies, and the donors together, that compassion. People wore compassion in their hearts, but you could see when they spoke and from their actions and their advice to APOC management that all was built on compassion for the poor, compassion to help the people, to alleviate onchocerciasis. So that strong motivation for me also spilled over to the national teams, the onchocerciasis national control programs. If you remember, APOC management at the initial stage, we had 19 countries. And so we were dealing with 19 national teams. We had to train them. We had to organize visits to them. We brought them to Ouagadougou. And as they networked and interacted, you could see that each of them developed from day to day, from time to time, a deeper compassion to really solve the problem of onchocerciasis and to get medication out there. That compassion led also to the development of tools by management and the non-governmental development organization and the technical consultative committee of APOC. Tools that will ensure that the communities actually received ivermectin. A few of those tools I would like to mention here is the independent monitoring tool. Initially, it was independent monitoring by the program staff and the national team, but later on, with the support of the technical consultative committee, that tool was changed to independent participatory monitoring. And we brought in the community people to be part of the monitoring to ensure that actually whatever is written in the report, they agreed to that. And that is a way of extending that strong desire to alleviate human suffering. We also brought up the tool for evaluation of community-directed treatment, and it was worked extensively by the non-governmental development organization. They worked on it, they reviewed it, the technical consultative committee. Then finally, we even went as far further to community self-monitoring tool, asking the communities to monitor their own actions and to give a feedback to the partners. So you can see the extent and the thread of compassion, the strong desire that compassion led to. Now, let me give just one or two examples and I will stop there. But for compassion, I wouldn't have seen Dr. Seketeli taking the risk, and I think that trip was with Adrian Hopkins, taking the risk of flying to South Sudan when WHO had not allowed its staff, the staff to go to conflict-torn countries. But both of them took a risk and flew to South Sudan from Kenya. And I think on their way back, just as they were about to leave, they had an attack by the rebels. It was also the same experience we had in Uganda when we had the first workshop in Uganda. We were asked to leave our workshop place by 3 a.m. because the rebels, the Red Army was very close, had approached very close to our hospital, to our residence. That did not deter us. Neither did the constraints of the field deter people like Professor Homeda, who negotiated with the military to allow households that are behind the military lines to receive ivermectin. These, I think, are actions that compassion brought up in people to make sure that they actually bring ivermectin and bring alleviate the sufferings of people in the areas. And as we took ivermectin, remember the training and the health education that went with it. If you read many of the monitoring reports, you will find that communities like those in Tanzania that had no idea of how to collaborate on health matters, how to bring health interventions to people. It was through the efforts of the EPOC program that they now began and started using the distribution of ivermectin to even bring other healthcare tools to members of their communities. So there is so much that this program has done or did for compassion, and without the foundation laid by the EPOC partnership, the NTD partnership today would not be what it is. That I can guarantee you, because all the partners of EPOC took that same compassion in their heart, that commitment in their heart, that very strong desire to alleviate suffering, and moved on with the NTD, with the NGDO coalition of UNCO, building the NTD coalition and transferring all that compassion and strong commitment to the next level, to the NTD coalition. And this is what we are enjoying today, reaping the fruit. And I do hope that continues until all the NTDs are eliminated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uche. You've shared with how compassion was the energy that drove this phenomenal outpouring of commitment and innovation. And thank you for really providing a programmatic perspective on that. That's a great way to segue into our next part of this session or our panel today on commitment. And for that, I'd like to introduce Professor Bernard Lisa, who is the chair of the Department of International Health in the School of Nursing and Health Sciences at Georgetown, and he will chair the panel on commitment. Thank you to all the panelists in the Compassion section, and we look forward to hopefully some time for discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for this quick introduction. And it was a wonderful, wonderful discussion so far, wonderful presentations. Bruce mentioned in his opening remarks the exceptional 20-year time frame the entire Onchocerciasis partnership committed to at the outset of the program many years ago, in the 70s. Not an entirely unique feature it was at the time. Eradication had gained some footing in public health. If we asked partners or professionals of the onco community, why did you commit to this time frame? The answer at that time was always, we need to bring this program to a successful conclusion. And then a little hesitation, and we will. This mindset was really a hallmark of the first OCP program. It was its organizational culture. Why? Well, think about it. An area twice the size of France in West Africa, multiple countries, larviciding every rapid in the many streams, every week by week, rain or shine. These were the aerial operations, ensuring that 600 human flycatchers were catching every week, they're checking every week infectivity, providing the logistics for refueling and restocking larvicides from the helicopters in this huge area, a precision operation requiring total commitment. Our session will now explore why this commitment endured throughout the 40 plus years history of the program. What role it played. We will look at it from the perspective of the multiple constituencies which together form what I would call the onco family. So it is a pleasure for me to first introduce Jean-Louis Sarbib, Director for Africa and the Middle East at the Centennial Group International, former World Bank Senior Vice President for the Middle East and Africa, Human Development. And Jean-Louis has been really deeply involved for many, many years from the donor perspective, from the bank perspective in this program. Jean-Louis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bernard, and thank you, everyone, and thank you, Catherine, for organizing this this wonderful family reunion. My first reaction when I saw the program was to say it's good that we're talking about compassion as the cement and the source of commitment and of innovation. But it's also important to remember that one of the ingredients that Bruce mentioned in the beginning is the involvement of the community themselves. Because to me, what was essential was that compassion gave agency to the people that needed to get involved. And as Dr. Amazigo said, this community-directed treatment was also a way to get information and treatment on other diseases. But let me just get to my sense of how the World Bank remained committed throughout the program. And it started at the very top. 1972, the McNamara visit with Chauffournier and the bet that he made that what these two French scientists that he met by, again, he wanted to understand what was happening. And he really made a huge bet that the bank would get involved in an area that was unknown to it up until then, health, as Catherine mentioned. And he did it, unlike his image of a technocrat, I think he did it mostly because the suffering that he saw on the banks of the Volta River became insufferable for him. And something had to be done. And I reread last night his 1973 speech in Nairobi, which I think may have had something to do with what he saw in the Yonko areas, the way he talked about people being deprived for making a living and for their deprived from their dignity. So there was very strong commitment at the beginning, and I think Bruce's book explained how he organized the bank to really get into a new way of doing it. And then this commitment at the very top was not replicated with the three presidents that followed him. They were not against it, but they were not particularly feeding the flames or maintaining the same level of high-level commitment. And that's when the commitment really became embodied in people like at the World Bank, like Bruce, like Bernard, like Catherine, and to some extent like myself, because we really were compassionate, and we were really realizing that there was something going on there that needed to be preserved, that needed to be protected. And I would like to introduce another dimension in this, which is the serendipity dimension, which is that for those of you who have read Bruce's book, you see that he was struggling of trying to figure out how to become a mainstream world banker. And he could not get a position in the mainstream, and how lucky we were that he didn't. Because to some extent, I think the fact that the program was not in the mainstream of the World Bank operation and career really allowed people to really look at it in a way that was a little bit different from the way in which you managed the career, or you moved people that they had to stay 4 years in the program and then moved on. Bruce stayed all his time and discovered that, if he really continued to show results, if he continued to be supported by the community, then the commitment will continue. Now, this was all right as long as the program did not need a new injection of responsibility and energy from the very top. And I think that's when the second jolt of high-level commitment came in the bank when Jim Wolfensohn joined the bank and became its president in 1995. And when we talked about compassion, this was a man who had it in droves. And he really, one of the first very early things that he did as president was to get interested in the Onco program and to agree to chair the donor meeting that made it into the APOC and spread it to the rest of the continent. So I think that what was interesting to me, and I was been reflecting on it, because to many ways, the Onco program was one of the very few great successes of the World Bank in dealing with the global public good. And the fact that it did this outside of the normal programs, in many ways, is a lesson that we need to reflect upon, as we need a new dose of compassion, commitment, and innovation to deal with the current great challenge that faces us everywhere, which is the pandemic. To some extent, where are the people, and I was talking to Bernard yesterday, and we were talking about who is going to be the Dr. Vangelos for vaccine, who is going to be the person able to mobilize the compassion of the community and be a doctor before being a shareholder of a large company. so that these dimensions need to be kept up. And when I was thinking about the program to say a few words today, this notion of serendipity was also one that I thought about, and it reminded me of the wonderful chapter of how ivermectin was discovered in Bruce's book. The fact that it almost got lost, and that it was only this little bit of the golf course that had this very specific thing. So and you need compassion and you need commitment so that this serendipity gets transformed into a successful program. Let me stop here, and thank you again for inviting me to participate.
Thank you very much, Jean-Louis, for putting the finger really on one of the issues. We are dealing with the global public good, and how the international development organizations that well positioned to do so. Question which we need to really more systematically explore. What is needed, particularly in the area of COVID. Let me now pass the floor to Uche. She needs no introduction because we have already heard from you. Uche, could you give a few remarks, please?
Briefly, I would say that the commitment at the community level or by the communities is something that is not far-fetched. It's obvious, and partners, I believe, are very proud of that. The communities showed a strong commitment to this program by action. If you look at the little paper we published recently in PLOS NTD, you could see that from the year 2000 to 2013, the partners had trained almost 5 million community members who volunteered to be trained and to be active. And out of them, 4 million of them were active in distributing ivermectin. Today, it's much more than 4 million. If you look at that data and you see that 26% of these 4 million people are women. And not only those people, if you go into the country data, a country like Ghana, you will also realize that almost 10,000 community drug distributors have served the program for 10 years uninterrupted. That is commitment. About 3,000 of them served the program for 18 years. In Kaduna, they are still serving, including those who have served for 18 years. They are still serving as distributors, this time not only distributing ivermectin, but including all other NTD drugs. So you can see that I think there is very little to convince anybody that the commitment shown by the communities themselves to this program and to improving their own health is something that is amazing and very encouraging to many of us. So if compassion is not the underlying factor, I think that attrition rate of drug distributors in the Africa region would have been much higher than it is today, because many of them are not paid, they have no incentive, yet they continue year to year to distribute ivermectin. And if you notice from the data that we also have, a lot of them trek for hours, up to 2 to 8 kilometers to reach the households and treat them, and would spend even more than 2 weeks, distributing this drug. So the other issue on commitment by communities I would like to raise is the support they provide to their drug distributors. Not only do they give them food or farm for them, many communities exempt the drug distributors from the community activities in return for the service they have provided or they are providing them. So what I think and what I would like to raise at this meeting is the need to document further and in a more systematic manner the commitment of African communities for in the fight against the neglected tropical diseases. Imagine a scenario where we have, where we can study properly or document properly community service towards elimination, and document for each of the projects how many community members have been distributing or serving either the ONCO program and LF program or the entire NTD programs for a certain number of years. We will see that that will bring a lot of information to not only the academic community, but also to the donor community. And that will make people very proud. So I think, yes, CDDs, one could also argue that CDDs complain about incentives. Yes, they complain about incentives, but it has not in any way reduced drastically the number of them that are committed to the program. So on that note, I would say that the communities have shown to be the bedrock or the cornerstone for the progress and the success of the onchocerciasis control program, and in fact, the NTD elimination programs in sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Uche, and thank you so much for drawing our attention to literally the enormous contribution of the African communities. And I would like to add the enormous contribution of African scientists, which you should not forget. We will get to that in a way, because you said it's a bedrock. Yes, it is a cornerstone of such a program. Without it, it would collapse. And I think, thank you so much for really highlighting it and putting it squarely on the agenda. And with that, I pass the parole to Johnny Jaipong. Johnny is presently the Vice Chancellor of the University of Health and Allied Sciences in Ho. He used to be the former Director of Research at Ghana Health Services. He has been involved in onchocerciasis for many, many years. Johnny, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Bernard, and thank you for having me on this panel. I just want to share a few thoughts as far as the commitment from the country level is concerned. I believe many of the issues have been mentioned as the various panelists spoke, but I want to highlight a couple of issues. I think that there was political commitment at the highest level, and this, in my opinion, was very, very necessary and a key factor for the success of the programs. There is no JAF or GPC meeting that I attended where there was not a minister of health from one country or the other coming to show their commitment, and even directors of the various ministries at the highest level played a very key role. And indeed, at the inception of the program, there was very high commitment from the levels of presidents and the regional bodies that were in charge of health within these countries. Beyond the political commitment at the highest level, there was also commitment to the operational delivery. You can have all the resources to deliver a program, but if you do not have commitment at the operational level, then it becomes a challenge. The work of the National Onchocerciasis Coordinating Committees at the various country levels, was such a very big issue as far as the success of the programs were concerned. The technical staff who did almost all the program implementation were from the countries. They received training, of course, from the coordinating centers, but they did the work. We talk about the vector control activities, the initial work of OCP. the countries were at the heart of this issue. So there was clear commitment. Uche has already talked about the role of ivermectin distribution in this whole story and the role the countries and the communities played, I think cannot be overemphasized. It got to a point where there was a need for devolution, and the role the various countries played to ensure the success of the devolution program, again, was so key. Without country commitment, there wouldn't have been such a big success. Then, of course, we look at research. I believe Hans will be talking in detail about some of the operational research activities. But even there, it was country people who worked with technical support to ensure that all the research was done at the country level. There were a few specialized centers like the Nkosakazi Research Center in Hohoe here in Ghana, which played a very key role in the drug development and for this whole program. So the countries were at the heart of this whole initiative. But you would realize that the whole OncoControl program was premised on economic development, and the access to the onco-free areas and the developmental issues that occurred afterwards was also something that was very key and required commitment again from the national level. So the nation at the heart of this whole program was that if the countries were not so committed, then the onco-free areas could not have been even developed, because eventually there were development issues and development programs that took place to ensure that those places were reused for agricultural activities. But for me, the key issue is what really sustained the commitment from the country levels. I think the bottom line was that the ordinary people, the leaders and everybody could relate to the issue. There were tangible things that we could see. I mean, everybody could see the blind people, everybody could see the people with all the skin conditions. And then after a period of intervention, there were tangible outcomes. Of course, the scientists could see the reduction in parasite reservoir, but the community could see the reduction in the burden of disease. And all of a sudden, we all began to talk about the possibility of elimination of onchocerciasis as a public health problem. So these things, in my opinion, basically gingered on the commitment from the country level, because we could see some light at the end of the tunnel. I've already alluded to the access to the lands, the fertile lands for agriculture. In the Fumbisi Valley in Ghana now, it's one of the biggest rice producing areas in the country. Hitherto, it was a no-go area. So now the black flies were not there in their large numbers. And even in the instances where there were a few invasions from time to time, there was no blindness again because the flies were no longer infected. That is another discussion altogether. But the economic impact and the impact on the quality of life of people was so tremendous. And obviously there was a feel-good factor. And this, in my opinion, is what actually gingered countries onto this. So I would like to say a very big thank you to Bruce for putting this whole piece together and bringing us all around to come and discuss these issues. I think it is a very, very important documentation which we need to take very seriously. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Johnny. That was said so well and so clear. Yeah, the feel-good factor, the way in which the countries really bought into these programs. You basically defined commitment. The next speaker is Hans Remmer, former manager of the onchocerciasis program research part under the Tropical Diseases Research Program. Hans had to deal with all the innovation issues. Hans, the floor is yours.
Like I said, thank you, Bernard, for asking me to talk about operational research and innovation, and especially for giving me only 5 minutes to do that. It is slightly difficult. It's a subject normally I talk a few hours about, and as all the interpreters know very well who tried to ask me to slow down talking, stop finally. So I don't know what I'm going to do now. I decided I have to give a bit the audience the idea of what it is about before we talk about commitment. Because operational research may not be clear to them what it really means in such an environment. So what I suggest I'll do is shortly talk about one short period of operational research, an intense period at the start of APOC, to give a picture of what kind of activities were involved, and then talk about the aspect of commitment of the different actors involved. The period I talk about is just the end of, or beginning of APOC, after the registration of ivermectin, and when it was decided, now we have a tool, we can do something about the rest of onco in the rest of Africa, beyond OCP, and we should launch a new program to get it going. But at that moment, the decision was made, we should do it. There were still many key questions to how to do it. The key questions were, why would you start a new program out beyond OCP? There are questions there. What are you going to do, where, and how? And to address those questions, the Tropical Diseases Research Program of WHO, together with OCP and the upcoming staff of APOC, launched a task force on onchocerciasis operational research to address those issues. And quickly, what were the outcome of these key questions? Why starting a new program? It was actually a fundamental question because onco was known as river blindness in an area where the primary problem was blindness. But we're talking now extending into vast areas of Africa where there were different strains of parasites which were not causing with blindness, but skin disease. And not everybody was clear if this was really of sufficient public health importance to launch such a big program. So that had to be clarified. And we did a study, a multi-country study, following up on some preliminary lead research of Dr. Uche Amazigo to determine and document properly the importance of skin disease. And what we found was actually skin disease, in terms of DALIs, was more important than blindness. And that gave the green light to go on with that plan. And the donors were satisfied that was justified. Then what to do exactly? Oh, ivermectin, yes, but what is going to do for skin disease was not completely known. So studies were done, showed it was effective. Transmission, yes, it has an effect, but limited effect. So you need to treat for many years of treatment before you finally have control. You must have a long-term perspective of annual treatment with ivermectin. And then in the long term, later studies we showed you can eliminate. And vector eliminate, vector control, yes, a bit in a few areas. So there was a package of answers coming there. Then another big one, where are we going to do the interventions? Where are the areas to treat? That was not clearly known. And it was a vast area we're talking about, nearly all of Africa. So had to be mapped out where the problem areas were. Using the classical methods to do that was impossible. Intervention, skin snipping all over Africa was not possible. So we worked on developing a rapid assessment method to quickly get an impression where the problem areas were and map that out. And that methods were developed, it was called REMO. APOC took it up and applied it all over Africa. And we got a map now complete of a very unique map, I think, of one disease completely mapped out in detail all over Africa. And later we did it with another disease also for loiasis. And then finally, the big question, how to do it, how to get sustained annual treatment. And that led to the big studies which resulted in that what you've heard about, the community-directed treatment of ivermectin, where the communities are truly empowered to run the systems themselves and find the solutions themselves, how to get annual treatment of their communities ensured for a very long time. So that was his initial package. In a very short time, gives us key answers through some very intense research. And that research used one model in nearly all those studies, which was the multi-center, multi-country study approach in endemic countries. Each question, we had studies done at different centers using the same protocol, bringing scientists together from these different countries. Often these centers were multi-disciplinary studies, with bringing in social scientists along with economists, with the epidemiologists and the public health people, developed the study protocol, and then implement it in the countries and get it going. And that was a very important methodology, not only to get good science going, but also get it standardized, applied to different countries, and interact already with the countries about where all this research is going and what the impact might be. It led also to reproducible results at large scale, because you do this in different countries. If you get the same result coming back, you have in a very short period convincing results that actually, yes, it is reproducible. It can be applied on a large scale. So that's where this went. And in a very short period, this answer was, all those answers were provided and APOC got going. Now, commitment, who got that all going? Who did it all done? I think the very first thing, and we haven't said it often enough, but I heard a few people mention it, it is the researchers which were terribly committed in all this multi-country study. It was quite a large number of people, an army, and nearly exclusively African researchers who did a fantastic job and did that because they were enormously committed to this research. Partly because they were exciting research, so we're very happy of implementing it, but primarily because it was in a disease they know in their area, and they are working towards a solution. And that was extremely motivating. And some of you have seen these people working. There's workshops going on to 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. I see David smiling. He has seen some of that, I think. And Uche and also has clearly seen that. I think John may have been in some of those things. But it was very, very rewarding to see them really feel they could do something and got a chance to do something, and they went for it full force. Supported by a task force of also very committed scientists, mainly African again, but some international ones. David was there, like I said, Uche was there, and other people. So that's the first group of commitment I would highlight, and an enormous important force of commitment from the African researchers working on interesting research on a topic which is immediate importance for their area and the people they're concerned with. And then secondly, I would talk about the commitments of the other side, the partners. First of all, the disease control staff, the public health partners in the countries. And then secondly, all the other ones supported them, including the donors. And there was a growing commitment for them also towards this operational research. And that was very rewarding for us to see in CDR, because often you see there is a differentiation between research and control. Control people or public health people often say the researchers, coming with all these problems and questions and messing up things, and we have to move, and they take that time and it takes forever. So in this case, we saw increasing understanding from the control staff that this is beneficial for their work. And by working with them already upfront in defining the research questions, the research agendas, and continuously reporting back every 6 months to them where this was going, they were more and more convinced over time and more committed to really support the operational research for the ultimate benefit. Now, Bernard, I don't know if you have watched, but I forgot to look at mine. I'm at my 5 minutes, presumably.
I think we are a bit over time, Hans.
Oh, well, that's up to the tradition. That's appropriate. Let us stop here then. Except for mentioning, of course, also the commitment from the donors, and the World Bank was one of them. And of course, the traditional TDR, APOC donors. And we have had very interesting and supportive and good funding from Gates, which was also extremely helpful in key moments. And the World Bank funding was, of course, particularly critical at this particular stage, because at that moment, TDR couldn't pay for all this work anymore. And the bank came in to fill in the gap. It was also extremely rewarding. But I think generally, it was this increasing commitment, which also affected the bank a bit, I guess. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Hans. That was very animated and clear in your presentation. And it was a perfect bridge to the next topic, basically, which deals with innovation. And Adrian has already been introduced, so I pass the baton immediately over to Adrian. Adrian.
Thank you very much, Bernard. And yes, we are a little bit behind, but we'll try and move through this fairly quickly. I had sort of thought of saying quite a little bit of introduction, but actually it's more or less been said. I think Hans said quite a lot of it. And I think the important thing is, as we move forward, it's more than a 40-year program, as we've already heard. Situations change, medicines change. We have to look at these ongoing new ways of tackling the problems. One of the problems that Bruce mentioned right at the beginning is the problem of lower or lowiasis. This is a problem in Central Africa, and it's been a block to some of the treatment in some of the areas in Central Africa. But we're beginning to see innovation that is actually now impacting on programs, even in that particular problem. So the first two presentations in this third panel, which is about lasting innovations, are related to mostly to lower. And our first presentation is from Amy Cleon. Amy's been working on lower for many years in Africa. And if you get lower and go to the States, you're likely to end up being treated by her in the States as well. But she has been very involved in some of the latest research going on in lower. But as we look at lower, there are some issues around lower that we have to look at. And so Amy's going to talk about the challenge of lowiasis and doing no harm. So Amy, over to you.
So thanks very much, Adrian. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a little bit different topic than what I normally talk about. This was the topic that I was assigned. And so just because there may be people on the call that don't know much about loa, I have one slide on the parasite itself. So this is just to remind everyone what Adrian just said, which is that the geographic distribution is in Central and West Africa. The areas that are red in the map on the right are the areas that are highly endemic for lowiasis. And you can see that that overlaps some of the geographic distribution of the other filaria that we've been talking about. It is spread by a vector, as are all the filaria. In this case, it's the Chrysops deer fly. And the clinical symptoms in patients are primarily related to the adult worms. And these live in the subcutaneous tissues. You can see on the left, the swelling in the patient's wrist, that's called a calabar swelling. And on the right, hopefully you can see in the eye of this patient, there's a worm just under the conjunctiva, and these subconjunctival worms or eye worm are really the most dramatic thing in lowiasis, although they really don't often cause much in the way of morbidity. So this is not in the eye, it's just under the conjunctiva and doesn't typically cause blindness. Most people that have loa do not have calabar swellings in endemic countries. A proportion of people will have eye worm, and often they can tell you that, but they're not terribly bothered by it. The real issue is that the adult worms make microfilaria or baby worms that are in the blood. You can see a picture on the left here. That's a really beautiful picture of a Giemsa stain of a loa microfilaria, just to give you an idea of the size. The dots in the background are blood cells. These have diurnal periodicity, and this is from Joseph Camneau's work. You can see that midday between 10 and 2, approximately the numbers of microfilaria can go up in the blood. And over here on the right is what's called a nucleopore filtration, where we took 1 milliliter of blood, put it through a filter. The black dots here are the pores in the membrane. And this is just to show you that people can have really high levels of microfilaria, up into the hundreds of thousands. And so all of these little squiggly lines on that filter are worms in the blood. So what's the problem? The real problem is that, as I said, the geographic distribution of loa overlaps that of Onchocerca volvulus and Wuchereria bancrofti in Africa, and that MDA using ivermectin can cause severe post-treatment reactions, including a fatal encephalopathy in people that have very high levels of circulating lower microfilaria in the blood. These people are exactly the people that don't have the Calabar swellings and often don't have any idea that they're infected. So they're walking around feeling just fine. You give them ivermectin and they can go into coma and die. So this was a really huge problem. The first report of this was really by Michel Boussinesq, who's going to talk soon, who described a case in Cameroon. And then subsequently, there was a paper in Lancet in 1997, which looked at what the incidence of this problem was and what the risk factors were. And what they were able to show, and I think this is really the important thing, that the risk factor is the number of microfilaria in the blood. And so you can see here at 8,100 microfilaria per ml. So this is microfilarial load on the x-axis and the risk or rate ratio of adverse events, serious adverse events on the y-axis. What you can see is that after 8,100 microfilaria per ml, these asterisks are a p of less than 0.05. So there's an increased risk of serious adverse events. And when you get above 30,000 microfilaria per ml, this becomes really highly significant. And so this brings up a number of ethical considerations. So when does the benefit, prevention of blindness in a population, outweigh the risk, some cases of death, at the population level? And this, at the beginning of the program, really was a little bit easier to answer because the areas were so highly endemic with large populations that were blind, and people felt a little bit more comfortable with treating and just monitoring very closely and trying to minimize the risk. However, now that the program has moved into hypoendemic areas where less people are actually affected and likely to become blind, this becomes a really more important question. So does the answer depend on the prevalence of onchocerciasis? Some people say yes, some people say no. Are the issues similar to those in an immunization campaign, where if you give polio vaccine, which has been done, live polio vaccine, you'll have some people that get polio, but that's an accepted risk in causing herd immunity. And again, some people say yes, some people say no. I would argue that this is really very different, because can even one death be justified if we can identify the people that are at risk? So with polio vaccine, you don't know who's going to get polio. But with this problem, we know who's at highest risk for having complications. So this is really a very dicey ethical issue. Way back, probably 10 or 15 years ago, there were a number of potential solutions that were proposed. One is obviously to use a strategy that doesn't lead to rapid clearance of lower microfilaria. If there were a drug that didn't do that, then you could use that in the control programs. And unfortunately, we really haven't been able to find a drug that works in a way that can be administered single dose and effectively that doesn't affect lower. And the second was to try to identify and exclude these high-risk individuals from MDA, what we called at the time test and treat, what we now call test and not treat. And that's going to be what Michel Boussinesq in part talks to you about next. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Amy. Yeah, I have a personal interest in both these diseases, onco and lower, from personal experience. So it's an important issue for me. But we are moving on now. As Amy's just mentioned, Michel Boussinesq, and you saw one of his papers there, been very involved in onchocerciasis research and done an enormous amount of research, particularly in Cameroon, but elsewhere. And a lot of research into lower as well. And he's presently in charge of research at the Institute for Research and Development based in France. And he said just before we started, he got home 3 days ago after lockdown for 7 months elsewhere. So we're very glad that he's home and can talk to us. So over to you, Michel.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Adrian. Actually, yes, one of the main problems is that Onchocerciasis can be co-endemic in Central Africa. But another problem is that onchocerciasis is targeted for elimination in 2030. And clearly, to achieve this result, we need new drugs and new tests to identify the areas where onchocerciasis needs to be combated during the next years. So regarding the new treatments, ivermectin is still there 30 years after it has been donated by the MDP, and probably ivermectin will be the main tool to combat onchocerciasis during the next years. But it is clear that ivermectin is not an ideal drug because it kills the microfilariae, which are the cause of the disease. But ivermectin doesn't kill the adult worms, and it will be great to accelerate elimination of onchocerciasis by killing the adult worms. So a number of groups still work on developing new drugs, and the one which is the more advanced is moxidectin, which is something like super ivermectin. With a much longer half-life than ivermectin. Moxidectin has been approved by the FDA in 2018 for onchocerciasis, but it is not still recommended by the WHO for large-scale use. And a number of trials need to be conducted now to lead to the approval and the recommendation of the WHO. So presently, a number of studies are planned and will start probably later this year, comparing ivermectin and moxidectin given either annually or 3 monthly, and so this will allow us to get more information on the impact of moxidectin. A formulation for children are also to be developed, and another trial is planned to do this. And so probably in 3-4 years, we will have this new drug, which could be applied to all the areas where onchocerciasis will remain. Other drugs are also in the pipeline. 3 of them have just finished the phase 1 trials. So the first one is emodepside, which is manufactured by Bayer and developed with Bayer and the DNDi, the Drug for Neglected Disease Initiative. And probably phase 2 trials will start in the DRC during the next months. The protocols are still being finalized. The other one is oxfandazole, which is also a new drug developed by the DNDi. And the third one is a drug which is an antibiotic which kills or sterilizes the adult worms. Actually, it would be the same if the adult worms were killed or sterilized. And this antibiotic, the Tilamac, manufactured by AbbVie, has been discovered by people who work on antibiotics which kill the bacteria, the symbiotic bacteria, which are required for the parasites. Presently, doxycycline, which is a well-known antibiotic, is active against the adult worms, but it needs to be given every day during 5 or 6 weeks to kill the worms. So clearly, it's not possible to distribute doxycycline as part of mass treatment, and so groups work to find antibiotics which could be effective in a course of 1 week or so. So for this AbbVie 4083, the phase 1 has also been completed, and a phase 2 is planned for the next months. We also need new diagnostics because presently, as it has been mentioned, the standard diagnostic test is the examination of a skin biopsy, which is not very popular in the population. So we need a non-invasive test to identify those people who remain infected after years and years of mass treatment. One of these tests is available. It is a DEC patch test, which is a patch which is applied on the skin of the people and which contains a drug which kills the microfilariae beneath the skin. And after 24 hours, you have a reaction if the individual is affected. There are also many attempts to find other biomarkers, but the progress is fairly slow. As Amy has mentioned, we also need new strategies in areas where loiasis is co-endemic, and there are two test and treat strategies which can be used. Either the identification of people at risk of serious adverse events after ivermectin, which would be discarded, excluded from mass treatment with ivermectin, while the rest of the population is treated. And the other strategy is to identify those people who are actually infected with Onchocerca volvulus and to treat them, if there are not so many, with a drug like doxycycline for 5 or 6 weeks. Another possibility to accelerate the elimination of Onchocerca disease is to combat the flies, the vector flies. Of course, it's not possible to spray insecticides in the rivers because it is very expensive, and in Central Africa, most of the areas are forested, so it's more difficult to use this technique. But recently, it has been shown that by clearing the vegetation in the rivers, you can decrease dramatically the density of flies and prevent the infection very notably. So it's what I had to say. I don't know how long I was, but many teams are still committed to help to find new tools to accelerate elimination of onco.
Thanks very much, Michel. I think we are now getting rather behind time, so we'll have to stop the discussion there. And I have planned, I was being asked to talk about challenges in Central Africa, but I'm just going to highlight a few things that I see as problems there. And I won't go into any of the details that I had planned to mention. I think one of the problems we have, and we've made reference to the lower scope, but is how do we get this out into the community? Because they're fine as research tools, but we really have to look at how we can get these in the community so that they can be used at a reasonably economic and practical way. But I think actually within Central Africa, we have perhaps other problems which in a way could be more than lower. And I think as we look at innovation, we have to look at these particular problems. And as I said, I'm not going to go into them, but a lot of the countries are very large with quite sparse populations. You know, when I worked in CAR, I kept comparing with Nigeria, and it just doesn't make any comparison. And yet we use the same strategies. You know, the population is so thin. You can go 300 kilometers in part of Central Africa and just find 5 communities. That'd be a bit difficult in a place like Nigeria. So large populations, sparse, large distances, sparse populations. The other thing is the general infrastructure, partly because of this very sparse population, partly due to conflict I'll come to in a minute, but various reasons, the infrastructure in these countries is often just been totally neglected. Roads are more or less non-existent, and this makes it very difficult to actually get around the country and reach those people who are at the end of the road. We often say people with NTDs, with neglected tropical disease or onchocerciasis, are people who live at the end of the road. I discovered when I went around, particularly Congo, Central African Republic, actually that's inappropriate. It's the people who live beyond the end of the road, because that's where the communities are. And so we have to look at how we reach those people with poor infrastructure. And there are ways we could do satellite mapping. We can think about drones. They've been using them in Tanzania, which seemed, you know, way out of our league a little while ago, but, you know, perhaps that's possible. The health infrastructure in these countries as well, because they are relatively poor, because they have had a lot of conflict, the health infrastructure is often not very good at all. And sometimes it's been destroyed. I had my whole office destroyed in the Central African Republic. I lost all my research, I lost everything. So you have to keep starting again. So we need to be innovative in ways in which we can actually fund and support these programs in those sort of areas. Other health problems. I remember talking with the Minister of Health in DRC, trying to do something about onco, and he said, I got 12 people coming to see me today. They all have their own health problems, priorities. They all have their own funding. They all want to do their own thing. And I can't run 12 new programs. Who am I going to choose? This is a sort of thing that we are up against. And finally, when you look at these countries, the countries with lower are the countries with conflict. Now, I don't think there's a statistical association with that, but actually, if you look at it, the countries that are most unstable are really the countries where we also see lower. We have to learn to work in these insecure areas. So with that very brief summary of what I was going to say, because time is going on, I'm going to hand it now back to Catherine to try and wrap all this together. So back to you, Catherine.
Thank you all. And as you point out, this has been an extraordinarily informative, thought-provoking set of discussions that hint at far more. And we have not, unfortunately, been able to come to any questions. There are a number of questions in the Q&A, which we will be looking at, and we'll send those out to you when we send out the video link so that you can share it with your colleagues and go into it. Trying to sum this up is impossible, and many of you have other commitments, but let me make a few points very quickly. The impetus for this particular discussion really was the challenge of partnership, which, as many of you know, is Sustainable Development Goal number 17. It is something that is emphasized constantly, that in today's world, no single institution and no single sector can be successful on its own. And we are clearly seeing that vividly in the COVID crisis right now. So this suggests, the lesson of the ONCO program suggests, first of all, that remarkable partnership is possible. This 43 years, over 100 different institutions, public, private, large, small, community, governments, all of them were involved in a sustained partnership. And for those of you who've read Bruce's book, you will appreciate that it was never easy. And it's still not easy today. It's been enormously complicated. And sometimes I think we look at the success that's been achieved, which is remarkable, as something of a miracle. What some of the points that have come out is, first of all, the enormous role that people caring played at the community level, at the government level. It is, of course, embedded in healthcare, the sense of caring and of ethical principles. It's very closely tied to many religious traditions, but of course it goes well beyond health. But I think that the link between the persistence, the commitment, and the caring and the discipline that went into making this partnership a success is important. For any students who are still listening, as well as for development specialists, I think this session has highlighted the important role also of the partnerships with science, with monitoring and evaluation, with sort of day-to-day work and continuity at the community level. So I think that that is very important. So sort of a bottom line is that cooperation, persistence, cross-sectoral interventions are not easy, but they are possible. As long as there is truly, I think one of the points that came out is when you can actually understand, people across these sectors can understand and see the results and can understand what they contribute. Part of the story of ONCO, which is not surprising, is that there have been enormous changes in the development profession in science, as well as in personalities and in personnel. I was actually struck at some point by the fact that you needed these relay races where, for example, I was the director and then Jean-Louis Sarbib was the director after me, and we passed the baton from one to the other. And one of the frustrations of life is that sometimes you're in a position where you can no longer have much impact on something that you care about, which has been one of the treats and the treasures of returning here. I think that the focus on end of the road, beyond the end of the road, the real suffering that these diseases cause still today, but also the fact that much can be done to eliminate them. I want to end in coming back to Bruce and his book, which I recommend to you, which is a remarkable feat of research and memory, but also a real willingness to go into the complexities of some of development and the work that's involved. But it also highlights something that came out, I think, very much today, and what some people described as the family, which is the enormous importance of personal roles, that what people did and what they stuck to, their creativity in making bureaucratic arguments, all of that was enormously important. I sometimes refer to bureaucratic courage, which sounds like an oxymoron, but in fact, many who work in government institutions have a grit and a determination and a commitment that in fact makes things possible. So I think that those were all remarkably on exhibit, starting of course with Bruce, but extending to each person who spoke today. And we thank you for your courage, for your commitment, for your compassion, for your innovation, and look to trying to draw more lessons from this really quite remarkable experience, which hopefully we will be able to translate not only to another partnership in the region I'm involved in, the Ouagadougou Partnership, but also to the challenge that faces us all here and now, which is the COVID crisis. and trying to assure the vaccination of large parts of the population urgently, quickly, with community involvement, and against a whole raft of challenges and difficulties. So thank you all very much, and you will be hearing from us. And we welcome very much further feedback and ideas.